welcome you all on behalf of CUTS to this two-session event on the happenings to the world of economy, a world of particularly in the context of the Indo-Pacific following Trump's ascendancy to the presidency of the U.S. the second time, including whatever else is happening. Now, as you've noticed, we've got two sessions divided on this. The first is the geostrategic session, which where we have this very excellent panel here, and the second is more geoeconomics, where we have others. And I don't know whether they have joined now or they'll probably join in at that point of time. And Pascal and Martin Wolf had had suggested a longer time for the fact is that they were busy with something else. But I don't know about the others; they might have joined. I don't see them on the screen. Having said that, may I request all of you, if you can stay on till later also and participate, you'll be very welcome, including share your views and experiences in the second session as well, because there is an overlap and there is a clear linkage between the first and the second session, except that we wanted larger number of views on these very critical sessions. And we have been fortunate to have Sanjeev agree to moderate this session, and an excellent organizer and an excellent NGO leader who heads one of the biggest Indian diaspora organizations in the world, with whom we've been working for some time. And we are very happy to have you here. With that, let me hand over the proceedings to Sanjeev. Over to you, Sanjeev.
Thank you so much, Pradeep. I must start by complimenting two sets of people. One is the CUTS organization and Pradeep and his entire team. Pradeep, as you have mentioned, we've been collaborating for some time now. I've had the pleasure of knowing you, and the body of work that you and your team at CUTS have accumulated over time in the foreign policy area, geopolitics, geoeconomics, trade, so on and so forth, really stands second to none. And so I must compliment you on the body of work that you have done, including the program that we are having here today. So thank you for having me. The second set of people is the distinguished panelists that I have the honor of moderating today. Some of you I know, others among you I know of, but am meeting virtually for the first time. But regardless of whether we've interacted or not before, this is truly a privilege and an honor to be moderating this distinguished panel. I know that we have about an hour and a half allotted to us before we move on to the second geoeconomics panel that Pradeep spoke about. So here's what I thought we would do. We are supposed to have, I believe, 6 panelists, and I'll just name them very, very quickly. And I'll name them in the order in which I intend to proceed with them. I'll tell you how I intend to go about this. And then we'll open it up a little bit later for a discussion and interaction and any questions that some of our audience might have as well. So we will be joined very soon by Meera Shankar, former ambassador of India to the United States, among other places. I'll get to her first. Second, we have Satoru Nagao, non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute. Third, we will have Talal Abu Ghazaleh, the chairman of the eponymously named organization, Talal Abu Ghazaleh Organization. Fourth, we will have Hosuk Lee-Makiyama, the director of the European Center for International Political Economy. Fifth, we will have Jorge Heine, who is the former ambassador of Chile to China. And last but not least, we will have Arun Singh, who is the former Indian ambassador to America, again, among other places. I wanted to bookend this by having the 2 Indian ambassadors or former Indian ambassadors bookend sort of the conversation, and then have the others interspersed in between. How I intend to do this is I will start with a slightly more detailed introduction, because there is a lot to be said about each of our panelists. They are very stellar luminaries in the world of foreign affairs. So I will start by providing a brief, necessarily incomplete introduction because of their long list of accomplishments. and I will go to each panelist. I will ask him or her for, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes of their opening comments, opening remarks. I will then ask maybe one follow-up question to each panelist based on not only their remarks, but based on some questions that I have in my head and that I've jotted down as I've been thinking about this particular topic. I know, of course, that the topic deals with free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And so we'll certainly address that. But given the vast and the wide expertise and the different lenses that our panelists have from different parts of the world, we might broaden out the conversation a little bit from there to make sure that it's free flowing. Because as all of you know, as well as anybody else in the world, foreign affairs, geopolitics, geoeconomics, geostrategy, they are all linked areas, linked issues across so many different fields. So that will take up, let's say, the first 40, 45 minutes of our conversation. So going to each panelist in order, a brief introduction, 3 or 4 minutes of opening remarks, maybe one follow-up question from me. That's the first 40, 45 minutes. The remaining 45 minutes at the back end will be a much more free-flowing conversation which will be moderated by me, and I think we'll welcome audience questions if we have that capacity over the chat as well. And we'll end at the very end within 5 minutes by closing remarks, 1 minute each panelist, 1 or 2 very key takeaways that you have from this conversation. Yeah, so if that's okay, that's the manner in which we will proceed. Like I'd said, I'd intended to start with Meera Shankar. I know she's about to join. She has not yet joined, although I'm told that she will in the next couple of minutes. Let me then move on to the second panelist. I'll come back to Meera in a short while. The second panelist, as I mentioned, is Satoru Nagao, who is a non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute. In addition to that, he's on the advisory board of the Jindal India Institute. He is a visiting fellow at ORF, the Observer Research Foundation. His doctoral thesis was on India's military strategy, which is quite apt, of course, for this conversation. And he is also a member of the Indo-Japan Maritime Security Dialogue. Meera, welcome. I see you on the screen.
Yes.
You've just joined.
Yes.
Delighted to have you, obviously.
Yeah.
I've just started with Satoru, so if
Sure.
you don't mind, allow me to
Yes.
go ahead with him for
Please.
about 3 or 4 minutes.
Sure.
I'll ask him one follow-up question after his opening remarks, and then I'll come right back to you.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you for joining. So Satoru, privileged to have you on this call. If you don't mind, if you could start with 3 or 4 minutes of your opening comments, please.
Thank you very much. It is fortunate to speak as the first speaker. This is just accidental first speaker, but it is honor for me. Okay, I need to point, Trump administration's diplomacy has 3 features. First one is America first. But this is directly linked with Indo-Pacific, I believe, because when we talk about America first, America need to focusing on China, not Russia, not Middle East, China, because China is only challenger against the United States, and China is only the potential threat against the United States. So that is the first feature, I believe. So view from the Indo-Pacific, it is welcome. Second one is diplomatic style. He focusing on the bilateral negotiation to deal by using the intimidation. So every time intimidation is the set, so everyone surprised when we need to talk with the Trump administration, because the intimidation needs one kind of the surprise attack. And the tariff he liked tariff very much, the most beautiful word he said. So that's why every time we need to focusing on tariff. And but other intimidations also happen when he talk with Zelensky. We hear something on special words, only 4% support, or the dictator, or something like that. Indeed, the contents are not important. This is just expression of his frustration and making pressure to deal. That is intimidation. And so diplomatic style is second feature. Third feature is what kind of topic he focusing on. When we check, when compare the joint statement of the two summits, the US and Japan and the US and India, we can find the similarities. So he did not, the joint statement did not include environment issue, ideology-related issue, vaccine diplomacy. These are not the topics he focusing on. Instead of this, he focusing on trade friction, or imbalance or something like that, or weapon trade, or energy, importing energy in Alaska or something like that, or advanced technologies, because he focusing on the competition with China. And in this case, weapon, energy, the advanced technology, these are indeed issue. And he came from businessman and trade. So that's what, and he's one kind of the entertainer. So that is the reason every time the people surprised with his remark. But at the same time, view from his background came from entertainer, the businessman. Indeed, it is understandable. He is not political elite or scholar. These kind of things are not his background. His background is entertainer and businessman, something like that. So view from the Indo-Pacific, we need to check these three. Firstly, the focusing on China is welcome. And secondly, this is a problem because he focused on bilateral negotiation. So to form the multinational frameworks, this is difficult. So that's why, and we need to prove how our value is very important for the United States. We need to prove in front of the United States. So that without this, we cannot get support from the United States. For example, the Ukraine need to show the rare earth. In Japan, there is no good rare earth to deal with it. So to get support from the United States, what should we do? This is the matter. And so we need to prove something. Maybe we need to prove our influence in the Indo-Pacific. Japan need to prove in front of the United States. And we are valuable for the United States, we need to say. And another thing is, we focusing on the issue he focusing on, but we do not need to focusing on the other issue he do not need focusing on. For example, the environment issue, ideology, the vaccine diplomacy, this is not matter. But we should import weapons, or we talk about energy security or advanced technology. These are the issues his administration focusing on. So that will be the new issue in the next 4 years. That is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satoru. I appreciated your laying it out into 3 points. But while you were nailing your 3 points, I also appreciated the breadth of what you covered, because that goes back to my initial comments at the very outset, which is that there are so many issues in the geostrategic foreign policy economic space that are all interlinked. And you can't quite divorce one issue from the other, because one issue necessarily has spillover impacts on a lot of other topics, as this panel knows very well, and I'm sure many in the audience know very well. One thing, for my one follow-up question to you before I go to Ambassador Meera Shankar. Satoru, I want to bring in your Japan lens, which I know you ended your comments with. By the way, where are you joining us from today? Are you in Tokyo at this moment?
Yeah, from Tokyo.
Wonderful. Just evidence of the kind of global body of speakers and audience that Cuts has done a wonderful job of building today for this program. Let me ask you from the Japan lens. You know, one of the things that you talked about the bilateral statements. U.S. India recently, when Prime Minister Modi came to America, one of the first foreign heads of state to visit America after President Trump started his second term, there was a lengthy statement issued by the two countries, a joint statement. And one of the areas of emphasis that they mentioned was the Quad. As a matter of fact, even before PM Modi came to America, Dr. Jaishankar had come to America to meet with Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State. And they too had a Quad meeting and discussed the Quad, right? In fact, I believe, if I recall correctly, that was literally the very first official engagement of Secretary Rubio. So my question for you, Satoru, is, from the Japan lens, when it comes to maritime security, when it comes to a free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific, what is your sense of how the Quad will progress? Will India have some reluctance in terms of making it a full-fledged alliance? Will it be necessary to take some more proactive steps on the Quad? What is your perspective?
In my perspective, Quad is a framework against China. So when the US focusing on China, Quad is valuable. But the topic during the Biden administration, environmental issue, ideology issue, vaccine by diplomacy, these are the important part of the Quad cooperation. But now, the Trump administration do not focusing on these issues. So content will change. Content will be maybe more security because weapon trade or something like that, or energy security, or the advanced technology. Advanced technology is anyway included. So that's why these will be the issue, I believe. So content will change, but still, Quad is valuable against China. That is my opinion and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me go back now to our initially planned first speaker, Ambassador Meera Shankar, and it's a privilege to have you on the call with us today. Meera, just before you came on the line, one of the things I was mentioning is that I will start by doing 3 or 4 minutes of opening comments with every panelist, ask maybe one follow-up question. We'll do that with each of our 6 distinguished guests here today. And then we will have a much more free-flowing discussion after that, where all the panelists can interact with each other. Perhaps the audience can jump in with questions and so forth. And we'll end our 90 minutes of designated time with a 1-minute wrap-up where each panelist talks about their 1 or 2 key takeaways within a minute from this entire session. I know that you have time constraints today. I'm aware that you may or may not be able to participate in the entire session, but we are delighted that we can at least start out with you. Let me introduce Ambassador Meera Shankar a little bit more formally. She was the Indian ambassador to America from 2009 to 2011, before which she was the ambassador to Germany from 2005 to 2009. In addition to that, she has held various senior positions at the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi, at the Indian Center for Cultural Relations, ICCR, and indeed at the PMO, the Prime Minister's Office. She also serves on various corporate boards today. Meera, such a pleasure to have you, like I said, and over to you for 3 or 4 minutes of your opening comments, please.
Look, firstly, I think a lot in terms of how to deal with the Trump administration and its approach to the Indo-Pacific will depend on what his approach to China is. And on that, I think there is still a degree of ambiguity, because we have conflicting reports on how he plans to approach China. On the one hand, this view that China is the one country with both the capability and the intention to challenge the US in the long run, so focus on China. On the other hand, this desire to do deals, especially with his adversaries, and reports that he may be veering around to a condominium with the great powers, where he accepts certain spheres of influence within their ambit. So US in the Americas and the Western Pacific, Russia in parts of Europe, China perhaps in East Asia. So as yet, there's no clarity which view is going to prevail. Now, if you look at the whole US policy towards the Indo-Pacific, it comprised of 3 elements: collective security, collective prosperity, and rules-based order and governance. Now, collective prosperity, I think, has already fallen by the wayside, because first Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Agreement, and now he's withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Economic Framework, which was part of the agenda. And his America First agenda spares no quarters. So very much in the trade sphere, there is this, you prosper at our expense. We've got to prosper no matter what it takes. And if it harms you, so what? So collective prosperity has fallen by the wayside. Collective security, we don't know, because on Taiwan, again, there are conflicting views. On the one hand, they've dropped in the State Department statement of information, they have dropped the phrase that the US does not support the independence of Taiwan. Okay. On the other hand, Trump has made statements saying that Taiwan is just too far for the US to effectively defend it in the event that China decides to move in. So again, conflicting impulses. We don't know where the burden of collective security will fall. But clearly, Trump wants his partners in the Indo-Pacific also to take on more responsibility. He has sometimes cribbed that Japan and South Korea are not paying enough. I think we have to wait to see how this crystallizes. Yes, one thing is that he has signaled that he wants to continue with the Quad because it's the first group meeting, virtually coinciding with his inauguration. And the commitments are clear, but perhaps instead of a broader agenda of doing public good or focusing on softer issues, I think Trump will try to give it a stronger security focus. And India's challenge will be to steer it in a way where we are comfortable, because we have not been comfortable at being part of a security alliance targeting China, because China is right on our border, unlike the United States or even unlike Japan, where there's a maritime boundary, but not a shared land boundary. So for India, I think we have to proceed a bit carefully. I think sharing information in the maritime domain, strengthening collaboration and coordination on maritime security, I think these are all to the good, and we would be able to do that. Focusing on advanced technologies, yes, certainly India would be able to do that. Focusing on perhaps some degree of defense collaboration in defense manufacturing, again, something we could do. And here, during Prime Minister Modi's visit, the emphasis has been on underwater maritime domain technologies and connectivity. He's looking at connectivity projects. He's positively commented on the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. He has talked of other undersea cables, so connectivity projects. And I think that is what we will try to do. I think it's a kind of unsettled period right now till the Indo-Pacific strategy of Trump 2.0 crystallizes in a clearer manner. Clearly, everybody is watching to see, what reliability they can place on the US as a balancing partner for China in Asia, rather than one which will work out a condominium with China. Thank you.
I'm very glad that you also started, like the previous speaker before you, Satoru, you also started by pointing to the elephant in the room, so to speak, although that might be mixing metaphors in when it comes to sort of global geography. But we are talking about China, of course. And you're absolutely right. There is, an ambiguity about America's policy to China. It seems to one that is either a desire to keep the potential opponents and even allies of America, such as the word allies is even useful in today's foreign policy parlance, on their toes. Use unpredictability as a strategic tool. It's either that, or there is genuinely a lack of coherence in strategic planning. And it's perhaps both of the two at the same time. as Trump 2.0 crystallizes their thoughts moving forward. I'm glad you also addressed a breadth of issues. You talked about uh, alliances and how alliances mean little in today's times, how the Trump administration is tearing up alliances and so on and so forth. But within that, you mentioned another grouping that was very explicitly spoken of in the joint statement between Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi. And that was IMEC, the India, Middle East, European corridor. Now, of course, one recognizes that at this point in time, IMEC is more conceptual, even more so than the Quad, which has done concrete activities together during COVID for the public good. IMEC is at this point a concept, but it's a concept that Mr. Modi was strongly behind when India had the G20 presidency. France and the European Union has gotten firmly behind it, as you know. America under the Biden administration was firmly behind it. Where do you think IMEC will go? Will it move forward, or will it just be one of those things that remains on the drawing board and nothing concrete happens?
Look, a lot depends on how the situation in Gaza and the overall West Asia stabilizes. Whether the conflict continues in some form and there's continued instability, or whether the ceasefires can be converted into some peace of longer duration. I think that is going to be critical, because nobody will sink in money in a region which is in turmoil. And so from India's point of view, peace in this region is important. And I think at the moment, it's very much on the drawing board or at a conceptual stage, where people are still trying to work out the contours, but they are not, sitting back and doing nothing. I think that's the important thing. All partners are eager to try to move ahead, whether it's Europe, whether it's Israel, whether it's India, whether it's the US. I think all partners are keen to move ahead, but this is really contingent on greater stability in this region.
Noted. Thank you very much, Mira, for your remarks. We'll move on to our third speaker for today, our third panelist, Dr. Talal Abu Ghazaleh, who is the chairman of the Talal Abu Ghazaleh organization, and he's joining us today from Amman in Jordan, where he's based. This is a multinational organization, and Dr. Ghazaleh's career, he has been dedicated to promoting intellectual property rights in the Middle East and in the Arab world. He is a distinguished alumnus, and he has received an award from the American University in Beirut, among many awards that he has received. He's a widely published author, a patron of the arts, and he has also been recognized for his partnership and his support of the UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program. Talal, welcome to the program. If I can turn it over to you, please, for your 3 or 4 minutes of opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjeev. And I want you to convey my regards to Mr. Pradeep, who invited me to join this distinguished panel. And I'm honored to be among this distinguished group. I know that the subject is the Indo-Pacific, but also there are many Indos, other Indos, including now Indo-America and Indo whatever. And I would like to make an approach which may be not acceptable or convenient, but I am thinking of the world at large. I cannot think of India separately from every part of the world, similarly for America. Therefore, what I'm trying to say is we need a worldwide solution. We need a worldwide first. Like the America first, we need a world first. And that world first is becoming very pressing now because America decided to withdraw from the United Nations I think, decided. The news is that there is a motion in the Congress, but I know that this motion was started by the Republican Party, so the Republican Party would not make such a move without the consent of President Trump. Therefore, if you assume that he, and there are reasons why I'm convinced that it will withdraw, because that, in the view of America First, is exactly an implementation of the principle, because they can get rid of the funding they give, the hosting of the United Nations, which costs them tremendous money, and also as well the support for the United Nations itself, not just the hosting, and the other organizations, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, etc., etc. And if my good friend Pascal Lamy is there, I would like to salute him, and perhaps he could also, because I know him and I worked under his great leadership as president of the Council of Experts on in the World Organization. So about 3 years ago, I was approached by scholars who claimed or said, and I believe them, that they represent, they came to me on behalf or are commissioned by the State Department, and they wanted me to establish and moderate a panel between the US and China so that they can preempt a war, prevent a war. And that was, the idea is to get a panel of non-governmental leaders from the world, and who could talk together and discuss together the many problems, including major issues, each of which can start a war, and try to find solutions to be agreed upon by the experts and to be eventually submitted to the decision makers in the two countries. And I think this is a good gesture on the part of the US to propose that. Now I'm talking that was not put into force because, and I believe it is the right solution for it, would have been to be the US, China, and other countries. So what I'm proposing in brief, because of the time limitation, is what we need is a panel of experts, leaders from business and other sectors of the world, who can sit together and try to find solutions and proposals, and that would be for the sake of the whole world, so that we can save the world. This is a save the world mission, and I know that major countries can join, but also small countries should be invited. And so it gives a balance of some leaders, not countries, but leaders from countries. Of course, the blessing of the US and China is basic for a project like this. And this leaders' initiative for Save the World can be can start now, because things deteriorate more and more. I have already warned that many years ago that this year is going to be the start of serious crises in the world. It is starting, and it will accelerate. We know that the President Trump mission will last for 6 years, and we know that these new 6 years he can do a lot, and he can use his power, because we all know that the executive orders are his weapon, and he can use them without referring to the Congress or to any agency. Now, in order to close, I would like to say that an organization should start this process, not a government. And I'm suggesting that in diaspora, can be possibly the party that will try to put this project in action. And India is a great country, a great power, and should lead this exercise on the by the part of the private, non-governmental, independent leaders. And finally, I would like to say that we need a world that recognizes that peace, and as our excellent ambassador who spoke before me said, that peace is basic, but peace cannot be built without fairness. And fairness has to be the basis on which all organizations operate and the world system operates. We are living now in a world where there is no fairness and there will be no peace. We need a new world order, and we need a replacement to the United Nations, because if the US withdraws, there is no United Nations, because you have to relocate the hosting. The US does not want to host it, and therefore you need to find a new location, a new structure, a new everything. So a think tank like this needs to start as of now. I'm sorry I'm making this recommendation because I was asked to try to think about it, and I have no time to be involved in future because of many other responsibilities that I have. But I think a serious approach will help. On my part, I'm finalizing a book on this subject, on a new fair world order. The title of my book, which will come out in June, is A New Fair World Order. A world order which is not fair will not provide peace. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I exceeded 1 or 2 minutes of my time.
Not a problem. Thank you for your remarks, and thank you for your vote of confidence. Although I must say that the only thing Pradeep asked me to do was moderate a panel, not facilitate world peace. So you've put a heavy mantle upon our shoulders here today, Talal. Let me ask you one question. You know, obviously it's amply evident that you have been extremely involved over the past several decades in track 1.5 dialogues, track 2 dialogues on a multilateral basis with various governments and multilateral agencies. But you also are a successful entrepreneur and a business person. And my question for you, I'll ask you the question and then I'll just give you a quick anecdote as to why I'm asking the question. It may help illustrate why I'm asking. My question specifically is, what is the role that business can play in coming towards this more peaceful, fairer, more just global world order that you speak of, Talal? And the reason I'm asking you this question is I think everybody on this panel is well aware. We have some very informed audience members as well who are all aware that India-Canada relations at this moment in time are not exactly hunky-dory, to put it mildly. And in Diaspora being a global organization, we were invited to participate in a Chatham House Rules, very high level sort of exclusive conversation in Toronto late last year, with the topic being, can business transcend diplomacy? And it seemed to several of the august people that were in attendance at that event that indeed at this moment in time, business is one of the key things that can keep Canada-India relations alive until they kind of hopefully get better again over time. Regardless of which political party is in power in Canada, they have elections coming up. It's going to be a process, right? And so my question to you is again, what is it that business can contribute towards this new global world order?
In my first encounter with Secretary General Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, at the very big, I went on with the delegation from businessmen, as it was the International Chamber of Commerce. And we went there to congratulate him on the job. And I said, Mr. Secretary General, don't you want to have a legacy for your term? He said, what do you mean? I said, this is an organization for governments, the United Nations. What we need is a partner who is basic to this enterprise. And I think there should be a role and a way to introduce the business community into the United Nations. So he said, okay, I will talk to you about this. And we met several times after that. And then we started and established together what is known as the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact is about the responsibilities of business and society and in non-governmental organizations, the responsibilities to society. So we wrote and adopted 10 principles dictating what business should have as a responsibility in society. And I'm honored that I served with him as his vice chair. And it's the only time that the UN Secretary General became a president or a chairman of an organization. And I insisted that he should lead it. He led it, and I was his vice chair. And I continued with the same assignment with Ban Ki-moon for the term of Ban Ki-moon. Why? Business creates money. It's not governments. And governments govern it. It is important to realize that business creates knowledge and creates wealth. You cannot ignore, and one of the major problems of this world is that the United States, when it was started, it's thought that the whole thing is governments. Only governments have a role in society. No, sir. The business community is the maker of money and is the maker of knowledge, and it has to be a real partner. Now, this is an example of what I have tried to introduce. There are many, and after that, we were able to introduce as organizations in a non-observer path. It was never there before. But now we are members of the United Nations, but on an observer basis and not as members. And in my book, I will emphasize this point that the world needs business to be a partner of governments and not just to be a subject to be governed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Talal. I appreciate that. Let me move on to our fourth of 6 speakers. We have Hosuk Lee-Makiyama. He is the director of the European Center for International Political Economy, and he's joining us from Brussels in Belgium. He is a widely published economist and an expert on international trade and foreign affairs. He focuses on areas such as digital economy, intellectual property, e-commerce, and the flow of information online. He is also an advisor to the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Hosuk, if I can turn it over to you, please, for 3 or 4 minutes of comments.
Thank you, Sanjeev. For the record, it was 20 years ago I was advisor to the Swedish government. I was gloriously fired from that job. And one of the things that comes with actually someone who's no longer in the government is that you can actually speak freely because you cannot kill a man twice. And also, I really want to thank once again for the invitation and say a few words. And I've been asked to say a couple of words about transatlanticism as a token European, as someone who always gets to speak as a token Asian in Brussels and in Washington. It's actually quite a refreshing change. And because I, for one, I would say that
stop doing so. Does the French army have the same?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, please, Hosuk.
Yeah, let me continue. Although the other dialogue seem very interesting as well. I would say like this, and as someone who's spent his whole career more or less in Europe, I would say that the existential problems that we've seen, let's say, for the last couple of decades, whether it's climate change, whether it's about the emergence of China, Afghanistan, uh, the breakdown of the global order, EU-US alignment has neither been sufficient or a panacea to solve any of the global problems, at least not the existential ones. And I would go as far as saying that most Europeans now understand that the centrality of India and the Indo-Pacific is a natural, inevitable rebalancing of global economic order. There has been a break that has served Europe extremely well, caused by war, communism, colonialism, call it whatever you like. But what we have seen in the last century, and which is coming as a great awakening and unraveling now, is that the Western European anthropology, in many regards, have taken this privileged status that Europe had as for granted. And I think the change in thinking is very much overdue. And in fact, it's not unprecedented. I mean, similar pivot actually happened to East Asia in mid-noughts under Bush 43 because of the focus on the Middle East and the war on terror. And that's when the Americans woke up and realized that actually defending Korean Peninsula had no actual merit on its own. And money spent on defending Europe now is very much the same way. It has no strategic merit for Americans. And it's a very different situation, let's say, than Japan or a partnership with India. Defending Europe is something that you have to do for its own sake. Aside from a couple of air bases, Aviano Air Base that the Americans need to basically protect Israel, there is no strategic merit of Europe aside from defending Europeans. In that sense, I think Trump is a great catalyst, and he also highlights the fact that Europe and United States are still the most dangerous systemic commercial rivals we have on the planet. It's not just about China. If you look at the commercial relationship and what the markets look like, most US companies actually compete with European rivals rather than China. China is still too far behind. And also, if you look at it from more of a, let's say, a global order, rule of law perspective, Europe still wields a lot of soft power, and it has legitimized a lot of anti-American position over the last 3 decades, whether it's we are talking about the digital economy against the big tech, or we are talking about agriculture protectionism, or we are talking about corporate income tax. Across the board, Europe has legitimized a lot of positions that and actually codify them into the institutions. And I think also here's where Europe and Trump is on a collision course because we have it's not just complementary, it's a conflicting view of multilateralism. Europe genuinely believes in the rule-based order. Why? Because it benefits them. United States didn't even believe in P5. The Cold War is about P2, and now it's actually more or less about P1. And especially with regards to the commercial relationship, I think you can see an ideological cliff between the Europe and the United States, where Europe regards WTO as an institution, whereas the United States merely look at WTO as a commercial contract that can be terminated within 6 months. And this huge gap between the European position and the US position, and Europe as a much more dangerous adversary to United States than China or any of Mexico and Canada, if you want to throw them into the mix as well, really illustrates the sequencing of US tariff attacks against the rest of the world. I think it's deliberate that they have gone ahead with Canada and Mexico first because it and waited on Europe, because in the same way that you wait with the most powerful adversary to last. And also by waiting on Europe, you have avoided a scenario where Canada, Mexico, Europe, and maybe Japan and Korea and China would gang up with a joint retaliation against the Trump administration. And here maybe I should add here that I really do believe that it's more likely than not that we will see a China deal emerging quite quickly. Everything points to that direction. And I think we might see Donald Trump going to China quite soon, maybe already in a few months. But ultimately, coming back to the question about Europe, I think what Trump illustrates is that Europe lacks an agile executive or the nearly endless policy space that Trump administration seem to have, and where US decline is often fueling efforts to prevent actual decline. I think Europe has still the tendency to sleepwalk into disasters. And there's, of course, the Ukraine moment is a huge shock for the Europeans, and mostly because Europe has never really seen United States negotiate away territorial integrity over the heads of the country in concern. And this is something that most Asians are very used to, and even Middle East are quite used to see that happen. But this has never happened to people with fair skin, and I think this is a huge shock for the Europeans. And not to forget the fact that Europe has been defended for free by United States, and it has therefore much more to lose. We may see an 800 billion defense package being approved today, but it's more than just spending money. Collective security guarantees under NATO, as it turns out, seem to be much worth less than a bilateral one that, for example, the one that Japan enjoys under MCS. Collective security guarantee is a no guarantee, whereas actually the bilateral order under Trump in East Asia seem to be more or less intact with a few caveats, and someone mentioned Taiwan before as well. But just to wrap up, I think there is a huge amount of resistance against changing status quo, not just in Europe, but elsewhere as well. And it's natural. There are some powers that have been, and I'm thinking about countries like France and Germany, perhaps most of all Germany, but also countries in the Indo-Pac who has been enjoying a status quo that is extremely beneficial. It has been able to trade. It has run a huge trade surplus, and at the same time, and enjoy the security guarantee. And some of us have gotten energy for free, more or less, from Russia, and being able to trade with all the partners on the world is something that is completely unprecedented. It's natural to try to hang on to that. And Trump is basically changing that order, as I said, with a huge amount of time compression as a catalyst. And I really urge everyone to not to focus so much on what Trump says or even does. We have to be able to distinguish between US instrumentation and objectives. I don't believe for one second that tariffs are not, I don't think the tariffs are the end game. I think it's a mean to bring everyone to the negotiation table, and without playing the demandeur. And here's, please do not see me as a Trump collaborator by any means, but a lot of what what the Republicans trying to achieve make a lot of sense for a macroeconomist. It's just a means of achieving that is extremely ugly. But if you take the table manners aside, you cannot explain to the US public why the world's most technologically advanced and productive economy is running the world's largest trade deficit. That's something that you cannot explain to an American, and which, of course, most people in the world have unfortunately taken for granted. And there is a natural way of rebalancing, let's say, government spending if you want to fight inflation. But the way it has been done is extraordinary in terms of ugliness. And in order to basically balance this equation out, if you want to balance the current account, you need to bring some of the savings that is currently sitting on European bank accounts that needs to come home to the United States that is held by the US multinationals. And in order to boost investment, you need to basically make all these parts happen. What I'm trying to say perhaps is that what Trump is trying to do is to turn its economy more normal, more like Europe. And this is, I think, something that hasn't dawned on a lot of people around the world. And there is, of course, a net loser on this. And the net loser, not least on the Ukraine deal, is Europe and maybe China. But most of all, it's the multilateral institutions. You can even say that this tariff war we see now is America's way of restarting the Doha round in a hub and spoke model. If you sit with all the cards, you don't need an institution. You don't need a multilateral order. You can place yourself in the middle and negotiating with everyone. And as a final word, departing word, I'll just say the worst scenario that we might be embracing for is United States leaving the WTO within, let's say, this year. And that will highlight a very big question because the United States is bankrolling the multilateral trading system with a $1.2 trillion in trade deficit. How are you going to get the ASEAN, Mercosur, Europe, India, and African Union to comply with the WTO rules if there is no export-led growth financed by the United States? That means that Europe, and maybe with China, would have to open up their economies and offer at least $1 trillion to get on the table. Right now, I don't see that happening. That keeps me awake at night. Thank you.
Thank you, Hosuk. Before I get to my very quick follow-up question with you, I do want to, by the way, keep an eye on the time. We have about 34 minutes left by my clock to end this panel. But before I get to the very quick follow-up question for you, I do want to acknowledge a couple of people that have joined us who are part of the next panel. They are very distinguished people in their own right, and we are looking forward to what they have to say as well. I see Kanwal, Sibal, and I see Stuart Harbinson on the line. So glad that you are taking the time. Appreciate your time for joining a little bit early. Thank you. Hosuk, a quick question for you, a follow-up question from your European lens. I want to ask you an India-specific question. The India of today is reaching out proactively to various European countries, whether you talk about Germany, France, various different countries, Italy, one can go on and on. But India is also a very sought-after partner today for those European countries. And so my question for you is, in light of the new Trump administration, where a new playbook is being written for global foreign policy, foreign affairs, multilateralism, or lack thereof, can India-European relations be a bit of a strategic counterweight for both of those areas of the world to India-US relations?
That's a great question. Let me try to break it down in parts. In trade, I'm afraid that India and Europe are actually negotiating with their own mirrors. They are both keen on keeping their trade balances in check. They both want to have an export-led growth. And very often since Europe still focuses on light manufacturing, there's a conflict of interest when it comes to the commercial side. If you look at the strategic aspect, I think there is a great deal of cooperation that can be had, and not least in the defense industry. And there has been a history of, not least between India and France. And I would perhaps say like this, that in defense industry is not the same as defense cooperation. This is a part that many Europeans don't understand. Making weapons is not the same as using them and putting boots on the ground. To what extent does India actually have an overlapping interest or even see any utility and in Europe able to project its power all the way to India and beyond? I think there is a great deal of consensus right now, not least in the quote that Nagao-san was talking about before, that inviting Europe to Indo-Pacific may actually create more problems than it solves. So I think India needs to be really careful about where it sees common strategic vision and a similar endgame where Europe can actually make a difference in changing that end game into India's favor. I don't personally see it, but I don't have the greatest imagination. And I also know that Europe, when it's given a choice between looking at the West and the East, it always look West, because that's where its rationale and where its existence is rooted.
Thank you, Hosuk. Let me move on to our fifth of six distinguished panelists. And I'm referring here to Jorge Heine. He is the former ambassador of Chile to China from 2014 to 2017. Previously in governmental service in Chile, he has also been the Minister of National Assets, and he used to be the Undersecretary of Aviation. He's a research professor at Boston University, where I assume he's joining us from today, where he's also the interim director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for Study of the Long-Range Future. He used to be, very pertinently for this conversation, ambassador from Chile to India, 2003 to 2007, and before that, South Africa, 1994 to 1999. So a lot of global South expertise there wrapped into one person. He is a prolific author and a global educator. Jorge, I invite you for your opening comments.
Thank you, Sanjeev. And I would like to thank Kutz for the very kind invitation to participate in this very distinguished panel. We are living in very troubled times, and it's important to reflect about what they mean and the way forward. First point I would like to make is that it's important to understand that what we are seeing under the Trump administration, surprising and shocking as it may be to some, it is not simply sort of the willful result of, one man. It responds to much deeper changes that have to do with something that has been called a polite crisis. We have been through in the past few years through a pandemic, the worst in a century. We are now in 3 significant wars, Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan. We are witnessing extraordinary situations of drought and food scarcity around the world, mass migrations. These are all crises that feed into each other, creating a vicious circle, creating a loop, which makes things a lot worse. We're also witnessing the process of deglobalization. Since the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, the increase in global trade has been lower than the increase in GDP. And as a result of that, we are facing all sorts of challenges and problems. Now, having said that, the question is, what does the Trump administration entail? And I take the perspective of the global South and of the Latin American countries on the west coast of the Americas that also are part of what is happening in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific more broadly. Countries like Colombia, like Chile, like Mexico, like Peru, that are part of APEC and the CPTPP, and look with great concern at what is happening in the world. Now, the first point I would like to make is that the degree to which sort of the world order is being upended is illustrated by 2 terms that you may have heard. One of them is nearshoring, the other is friendshoring. With the pandemic, it became very common here in the United States to say that the value chains needed to be brought closer to the United States and to countries that were neighbors and so on. And 2, they needed to be ideologically aligned so as not to create potential conflicts in the supply chains. So obviously, 2 ideal countries for those purposes were Canada and Mexico. Now, lo and behold, which are the countries that are being targeted by 25% tariffs by the United States? Canada and Mexico. So where is the conventional wisdom with friendshoring and nearshoring? Now, the basic challenge, and I look at it now, I'm taking off my academic hat and look at it from the perspective of a policymaker. What to do in this very uncertain environment? How to react with the myriad of measures that are being announced by the Trump administration? Things like annexing Greenland, taking back the Panama Canal, designating the Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations and thus opening the doors to direct military attacks in Mexican territory by the United States. These are only some of the things that have been put on the table. What to do? What is to be done under such uncertain circumstances? Now, what is interesting here, it seems to me, is that even in these short 6 weeks, we already have some evidence on, I would argue, what not to do. In the case of the Panama Canal that has been targeted by the U.S. administration, we have had a number of things that tell us which way things are going. Secretary Rubio visited Panama, the first visit by a Secretary of State abroad since 1911 to be undertaken to Latin America, okay? Now, in that particular visit, the plan was not to have Secretary Rubio actually visit the canal itself, because that would be seen as him somehow checking out the real estate that he wants to annex. Well, that was the plan of the Panamanian government. It didn't work. Secretary of State Rubio ended up visiting the canal. Number two, the Panamanian government, in its wisdom, decided to sort of throw a bone to President Trump and said, we will leave the Belt and Road Initiative. You think China is playing too large a role in Panama? We will leave the Belt and Road Initiative, something that had not been asked. And third, as you may have seen, and I think this was on Tuesday, there are two ports in around the Panama Canal, one on the Atlantic side, one on the Pacific side, that were managed by a Hong Kong company, C.K. Hutchinson. And they were bought by a U.S. fund, BlackRock, for $2.3 billion. And the argument there was that, a Hong Kong company was putting somehow in danger the Panama Canal and would be under Chinese control. Well, Panamanians thought that having done those two things, they would be on the safe side, and that the Panama Canal would be under Panamanian sovereignty forever. Well, that didn't happen. On that very night, on Tuesday, in his speech at Congress, President Trump said, we will take back the Panama Canal. My point is this: giving in to whatever the Trump administration demands may not be necessarily the right approach. It will only go for more. And there's a lesson there, it seems to me, that all of us should keep in mind. Now, moving on to the issue of the Indo-Pacific. There is no doubt that things in the Indo-Pacific are going to be affected also quite seriously by the measures of the Trump administration. And the big question there, of course, is the role of India and how India will react to this. We all know that there are excellent relations between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. They were ratified by the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to Washington, which from all the reports I've seen went extremely well. And obviously there's much to be said for that. Now, the broader question, it seems to me, that comes to the fore is, as these relations evolve, what should the role of India be in the Indo-Pacific? My own view is that India, of course, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but more broadly, plays a key role in the balance of power, independently of the fact that these different changes that we have seen. I would argue very strongly that the key dynamic in years to come will be the tensions and the great power competition between the United States and China. It seems to me that will be the determining factor in world affairs in years to come. In that context, the question is, what should China do? What should India do? And it seems to me that there will be a great temptation to give in to the Trump effect and, for all intents and purposes, play along with whatever the Trump administration wants to do in the Indo-Pacific. There is a strong argument in one sector of the Trump administration that argues that the United States should get away from Europe, that Europe is basically a lost cause, and that is why they are so intent on getting peace in Ukraine, and that the real danger is posed by China. Resources are limited, and therefore the United States should focus not on Ukraine, not on Russia, but on China. So what happens then? And obviously, for this sector, using India to balance China is seen as a key instrument. Thus, the charm offensive that we have seen with India in the past few years. My argument would be that giving in to that temptation, Oscar Wilde used to say about temptation that the best thing is to give in to them. I would say that would be the wrong approach. India's advantage is precisely that it holds the balance, that it can steer things in one way or the other, siding with China on some issues, siding with the United States on others. If it makes a choice, whatever choice it makes, it's clear it wouldn't be siding with Beijing. But if it makes a choice of siding with Washington, it seems to me it would give up that advantage and therefore would cease to be in the very middle of this balance of power. That, it seems to me, is the key challenge. Now, some would say that, of course, is very much in keeping with India's tradition of non-alignment, going back to the 50s and 60s, and to the current approach that India has followed, I would argue, very successfully under Prime Minister Modi and the very able conduction of Foreign Minister Jaishankar, that they call multi-alignment or strategic autonomy. But I would argue that that approach will face severe strains in years to come, precisely for the reasons that I have said. Now, the other point I would like to stress is that for India to make the most of this key position it finds itself in the Indo-Pacific, the whole idea behind the change from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific that we have seen in the past few years on the part of U.S. policy is to put India front and center. The notion of Asia-Pacific was seen as too closely identified with China. It seems to me, though, for India to really play the role it could in the Indo-Pacific, it will have to open up its economy far more than it has. It seems to me that the protectionist approach with very high tariffs that India has followed until now. India is not part of the RCEP. It is not part of APEC. It is not part of the CPTPP. It is part of SAARC, which is probably the least integrated regional trade agreement anywhere in the world. And that, it seemed to me, would be the way forward. I was very encouraged by the visit of Mrs. von der Leyen last week in a high-level European delegation. It seems to me that a free trade agreement between the European Union and India would point very much in the right direction. And let me finish with a dictum by Henry Kissinger, who said, if it is dangerous to be America's enemy, to be America's friend can be fatal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. You covered a lot of ground and a lot of different subjects. I think one can perhaps ask you, 10 or 12 questions, but let me at least ask you one. And let me make that Chile specific. This is about Chile's relations with both India and with the United States. As you know better than anybody else, mining is one of the key industries in Chile. Lithium is one of the key minerals that Chile possesses. And lithium is one of the key minerals that is sought after in the global supply chain nowadays for chips, semiconductors, and various other high-value instruments. Now, in terms of President Gabriel Boric, given his political background, given some of his statements which tend to be towards the left of the political spectrum, he has talked about having a nationalized company for Chile's mining assets and so on and so forth. He has been described by various people as being sort of part of the woke new generation of political leaders. Also, although one might say that in his case, he has moderated over time since he has assumed office as compared to his earlier campaigning days. And as far as Chile and India are concerned, the two countries have had strong relations over time. I know a president that you served under, Michelle Bachelet, visited India, although that might not have been when you were ambassador, that might have been a few years after that. So, it would seem that both in terms of resources and in terms of relations and connectivity, there is something that Chile has to offer to India, to America. There is something that Chile has to gain from India and America. But yet at the same time, there is an inherent tension about the political proclivities of the current Chilean president that may not sit well with the American administration. So let me ask you where Chile sees itself in terms of its relations with India and America, and can it balance both of those in sort of both of those important relationships?
Thank you, Sanjeev. And thank you for your references to the visit of President Bachelet. Yes, that was after my time. But I am privileged to say that it was under my watch that the first presidential visit from Chile to India took place in 2005 with President Lagos. And that gave a strong impetus to the relations that we have had since then. And after that, in 2006, I myself signed a trade agreement between India and Chile, the first between India and any Latin American country. So Chile has about 21% of the world's copper reserves, and it also has one of the largest lithium reserves in the world. So this means that for e-mobility, obviously copper and lithium are key. And I see enormous potential for working there on e-mobility. That is something in which India can play a significant role. For us, the challenge really is how to add value to these natural resources that we have. Until now, basically what we have is we export them. Chile is the biggest export of copper in the world. About 50% of our exports come from mining mostly copper. The challenge really is how to move forward and add value to that. And it seems to me that their partnerships with India could play a significant role. On the question of political ideologies, I have, with some colleagues, we've published a book on what we call active non-alignment that refers to the position that we argue countries in Latin America and more broadly in the global South should take. And that is not to align ourselves with either Washington or with Beijing, but rather keep our own interests front and center. And this takes a page, of course, from the Indian foreign policy tradition. Let me give you an example of how this works and why Chile has been particularly successful in doing that. President Boric, in the span of 10 days, in late October 23 and early November 23, he visited Beijing, has a state visit there, participated in the third International BRI Cooperation Forum, and 10 days later was in the White House, received by President Biden to put together a cooperation plan between Latin America and the United States. Now, not very many developing country leaders can be received by Xi Jinping and 10 days later by the US president. And that is what Chile has done. That is, you work with both parties, keep your interests front and center, and make it work. So I would argue this is not a question of left or right. It is a question of putting your own interests front and center and acting accordingly, seeking middle ground. And that is what India has done for a very long time. We take a page from that. And we think that active non-alignment is very much the way forward. Other countries around the world, South Africa has now embraced active non-alignment, so has Colombia, and we think that is very much the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. It gives me special pleasure to go to our sixth and last speaker. Arun Singh is someone that Indiaspora has collaborated with over time. We have had tremendous respect for his work. He was, of course, ambassador to the United States, among other countries. I'll provide a more fuller introduction very shortly. I don't know if you recall this, Arun, but there were a couple of events where we have indeed spoken together. One was in New Delhi in, I believe it was 22 or 23. I cannot remember exactly. It was a closed-door Chatham House I2U2 dialogue, sort of a track 2 dialogue, if you will. And then before that, indeed, when you were in America, when you were the ambassador, there was a conference in Philadelphia where you were the keynote speaker. And immediately after you, I was moderating an Indiaspora panel on the substance of your remarks. So delighted to reconnect. Let me provide a formal quick introduction. Arun Singh was the ambassador from India to America in 2015 and 2016. Previously, he has been ambassador to France 2013 to 15 and Israel from 2005 to 2008. He was also the deputy chief of mission from India in Washington, D.C. from 2008 to 2013. He is a senior fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, a senior counselor at the Cohen Group, which advises corporations on foreign affairs and international collaboration and navigating geopolitics. He is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India, a highly regarded educator globally around the world. And in addition to the positions that I've mentioned, he has held several other senior positions in the Ministry of External Affairs, with the PMO and in other countries around the world. So Arun, over to you, please.
Thank you, Sanjeev. So based on the comments that have been made so far, let me just share a few thoughts. One, of course, everybody recognizes that we are in a period of uncertainty, tremendous flux, maybe even danger. I mean, those are the kind of terms that have been used. But in the context of China, I think the couple of trends that are emerging so far. So at one level, it is clear that the policy of the Trump administration, which will be related to China, is still being worked upon. And in his address to the joint session of Congress yesterday, there was no reference to what the US-China policy would be, and that has been noticed. Everybody has pointed out that there is a deep divide in his team between those on the national security side, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, who have traditionally been seen as China hawks, and those on the economic side, the Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary, Elon Musk. These are people heavily invested in the China relationship. So where the balance will lie in terms of the approach to China is still being worked upon. As of now, the policies that have been adopted and the measures adopted with relation to China have not signaled a change from the past. So the tariffs have continued. 10% tariffs were adopted. Another 10% tariffs have now been levied. The restrictions on investments outbound to China, inbound from China, those are continuing. Some of the sanctions related to individuals, entities in China involved in hacking, involved in evading sanctions, all those have continued. So far, there is no specific measure of an olive branch to China that we see. Although clearly, perhaps discussions are going on behind the scene. We don't rule out that at some stage there may be some kind of a deal worked out with China, because President Trump always likes to signal that he can do things differently. He tried something with the North Korean leader in his first term. Eventually, that didn't work. So some deal with China they could try. And even in his first term, he did that limited phase one trade agreement with China, which again was not really implemented. But even if some kind of a trade arrangement is worked out with China, the US is not accepting that it is going to be the number two in the international system. Still wants to be the preeminent power in the international system. Whether they're able to do it or not, we have to watch. Now, if they want to be the preeminent power in the global system, the essence of competition vis-a-vis China is going to stay, especially the technology competition. And you saw what happened when DeepSeek information came out. The US market capitalization fell by $1 trillion. NVIDIA's stock value fell by $600 billion. So that deep technology competition is there to stay. Now, with that being there, US is bound to see India as an important partner, because US companies have recognized that if they are to maintain their global leadership in innovation in many areas, they need the partnership with India to deal with the challenge from China. Today, for example, as has been pointed out, 20% of the global talent for semiconductor design is based out of India. Many leading US companies in semiconductors, although India doesn't have fab, many US leading companies in semiconductors have said that the latest semiconductor designs have come out of India. There are today 1,700 global capability centers in India doing cutting-edge R&D and technology development work for the global operations for multinational companies, not for the India-focused operations. 60% of these are of US companies. A very large part of global capability centers worldwide are based out of India. So there is a certain convergence of interest in India and the US working together. And that will be one of the things also driving the Trump administration approach and policy towards India. That is reflected in the fact that as you mentioned, the Indian Prime Minister was the fourth foreign leader invited to visit the White House. You had two leaders from West Asia, Japan, and then India, a signal related perhaps also to the Indo-Pacific. And if you look at the joint statement that was issued after the visit, what it signals is a continuity in the relationship from the Biden administration. So for India today, there has been a broad bipartisan support in the US for the India relationship since 2000. And there was, a question whether President Trump or the Trump administration will want to continue with what was done in the Biden administration, because they've wanted to undo whatever was done there. And yet, the new term that they have given for the relationship is U.S.-India Compact, COMPACT, for the 20th century, and expand Compact. And they've said catalyzing opportunity for military partnership, accelerated commerce, and technology. That was exactly that. This is what was done in the Biden administration. And one major initiative in the Biden administration was the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, building a new partnership for artificial intelligence, quantum, cyber, semiconductors, space, biotech, defense. And then people were wondering that this was a very important area of partnership, but would the Trump administration want to continue? And they have continued. They have continued with all the elements. They've only renamed it. Instead of ISET, they now want to call it trust, transforming the relationship utilizing strategic technologies, which is the same thing. And in fact, one of the things that were done in the Biden administration, INDEX, India-US Defense Acceleration Ecosystem, bringing startups in defense technology together from both countries, they have said that worked very well. So here is the Trump administration praising an initiative that was done in the Biden administration. So I think from the India-US perspective, we have to factor in that there are strengths in the bilateral relationship which give interest on both sides to sustain that further. The second thing is that clearly the challenge that both have related to China provides an element of convergence. But India is not going to work its strategy on China based on the US strategy. There's a convergence of interest for which you want to work together. But India is not going to Americanize its security policy. It will be looking at how it pursues its own interests. And in the US also, there has been an argument that a strong India, even if it is not overtly anti-China, is in US interest, because a strong India is a natural constraint on some of the unilateral and assertive policies that China may seek to adopt. So I think we are looking at the India-US relationship, including in the framework of the Trump administration, including the framework what they may want to do in the Indo-Pacific. Because if you recall that the US Defense Secretary Hegseth, when he recently went to Europe to attend a meeting of the Ukraine support group, and there his message, controversial, but his basic message was that the Europeans now need to do more in the context of the European security. US has to focus its attention in the Indo-Pacific, where it faces, and that's the term he used, a peer competitor in China. And that's where they're doing it. So even as India works its relationship with the Trump administration, it has to keep in mind that the bipartisan support in the US for the India relationship must be sustained. And so as it works its strategy, it would not like to alienate the other parts of the US political system. And even as India does more with the US, it has to ensure that its equities in its other partners, Russia, European countries, countries of the South, they are also sustained, whatever may be the deepening of the India-US partnership. So those are some thoughts in the context of whatever is evolving today. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. That was quite a tour de force on the US-India landscape, and one would have expected no less from you. I know that we have very limited time left. I do have one follow-up question for you. Before that, I would like to acknowledge a couple of luminaries who are part of the next panel who have joined us a couple of minutes early, and we appreciate that. Pascal, Lamy, as well as Martin Wolf. Thank you for joining a little bit early, and your panel is about to commence within the next few minutes. Just a quick aside, I had the pleasure of very briefly meeting Martin about 20 years ago when he had come to testify before the United States Congress Joint Economic Committee. I know he doesn't remember that, but I do. So delighted to have this virtual acquaintance again. But Arun, back to you for one question, and then we'll have to close out, of course. I would like your comments on the US-India relationship in two specific contexts. One is in the bilateral trade space. Mr. Piyush Goyal, the Indian Commerce Minister, is currently in America, meeting with the US Trade Representative, meeting with the Commerce Secretary. And indeed, India has been repeatedly singled out for its tariffs, and that America will be imposing tariffs on India starting the 2nd of April is what Donald Trump said. So how do you foresee the trade element going? Do you see the chance of some kind of a deal between now and the 2nd of April? That's one. Second is on the multilateral side. There has been a tremendous emphasis placed on the Quad by the US, by India, by Marco Rubio, by Donald Trump, so on and so forth. But when the rubber meets the road, there is indeed a distinct chance that Donald Trump would like the Quad to move in a harder security kind of direction, rather than in a softer public good kind of direction that India would prefer the Quad to operate in. So if Trump insists on moving the Quad towards that harder security edge, how will India play that?
Thanks, Sanjeev. So first, on the trade issue, clearly that's a challenge. Even in Trump 1.0, the two countries had discussed for 2 years the possibility of doing a limited trade agreement, and that didn't work out eventually. Because whenever some concessions were attempted, there were existing interests on both sides, which would block the emergence of an agreement. So that didn't work out. And I think President Trump clearly remembers that. But now both have signaled that they're trying to enter into a multi-sectoral free trade agreement, and that the first tranche will be completed by the fall of this year. I have a sense that both are trying very hard to get to this. One driving factor of this would be that ideally President Trump would be scheduled to visit India in the fall, because the next Quad summit is to be held in India. And so that gives them some leverage that, you pin a visit around progress, some progress in the trade negotiation. And also, I think India can make the argument to what extent it would get attention in the US, one doesn't know. That if you're seriously discussing a trade agreement, elements of a trade agreement moving forward, and if both the countries have said that through expanding market access, you want to take the trade from the current level of 200 billion to 500 billion in the next 5 years, then that objective is not met by levying high tariffs on each other beyond what they are today. So I think they have to grapple with that and find the way around that. Now, as far as the Quad is concerned, I think clearly India would be happy to do more and more in the framework of the Quad. But India's approach would be that doing more on security issues perhaps is not the most effective way. Because Quad, to be really effective, should be also acceptable to other countries in the region. Quad always talks of ASEAN centrality. But ASEAN doesn't want more security cooperation in the framework of the Quad. They want Quad to function as an entity that provides more of the public goods. So if you want more acceptance of the Quad, it cannot be just based on a security-focused element of cooperation. And so I think from India, the objective would be to keep pushing for the public goods aspect rather than the security framework. And ultimately, I think India's basic approach has been, as many speakers have said, that you deal with security issues based on your own strength. You build your strength through your partnerships in trade, technology, defense cooperation, whatever. And even, while the collective security commitment of US is today is doubt, I would say that even the bilateral security commitment of the US today is in doubt. In the context of Japan and Philippines and South China Sea and what's happening in the East China Sea, US has made statements, but they've done nothing. And China militarized South China Sea, they've done nothing. They've done nothing to support Philippines in the context of whatever China is doing, whatever China has done vis-a-vis Australia. So even bilateral security commitment of US has so far been words, not really action. So that's something we have to factor in.
Thank you. Thank you, Arun. I would like to close out. I really want to thank our distinguished panelists, our 6 panelists who joined us today. Meera Shankar, Satoru Nagao, Talal Abu Ghazalesh, I apologize, Hosuk Lee-Makiyama, Jorge Heine, and Arun Singh. Thank you for this wide-ranging conversation on foreign affairs. And thank you, last but not least, I'm turning it back to Pradeep from Guts for organizing this fantastic conversation. And I know that there's another panel coming up which will be equally as interesting. So Pradeep Mehta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. It was indeed an excellent and a very delightful conversation that we had so far. And let me also welcome the distinguished panelists of the next session. Pascal, Martin, Stuart has already been there earlier, and Kanwal Sibal. Karl Mehta had to back out for some reason. Uh, Let me announce for the audience that we'll be producing a YouTube version of both the sessions as one particular. Unfortunately, the conversation that you had, Sanjeev, with Arun has very nicely segued into this session. So let me begin with welcoming all of you to the second session of this webinar on the new Trump administration and its implications for the Indo-Pacific. In the earlier panel, we did, uh, venture into many areas other than Indo-Pacific, but I thought it is important that we should have a global view. So we had Talal Abu Ghazaleh speaking about global peace, which is extremely important. And I still remember Pascal at one of our events earlier speaking about polylateralism, Talal. Polylateralism would mean that if unilateralism or multilateralism is not going to work, then we should have government, businesses, and civil society in global governance. That is something which has been debated sometime past, but I think I would like to revisit it sometime or the other. While the previous session focused on strategic affairs, but often veered into economic affairs as inevitable, this session will focus more on trade and economic policy, but will no doubt touch upon strategic affairs also. You cannot divorce one from the other because that is it's also the flavor of the day, as we saw. President Trump's trade policy indicates that the terms of trade will be determined by political might and pressure tactics rather than economic efficiency. Of course, Lee had a different view on this, just to inform the panel that these are tactics which Donald Trump is using, and this may turn out to be something which may not exist for long. Having said that, it has been just over a month and a half since President Trump retook office, but he's already sent shockwaves across to his trading partners, including the whole world. We've seen a flurry of executive actions, 2 rounds of tariffs on friends and foes alike, and a desire to levy reciprocal tariffs, which would distort the entire premise of a rules-based trading system. There is a clear intent to not be bound by any institutional constraints, whether they be of equal or co-equal branches of the U.S. government, such as Congress, or in terms of legal frameworks laid down in free trade agreements or at the World Trade Organization. There is less talk of rule-based agreements and more of arrangements, quote unquote, which can manage, quote unquote, the trade relationship a country has with the U.S. Use of tariffs to achieve U.S. domestic policy goals of curbing illegal immigration and drug supplies, as has been voiced, and forcing trading partners to commit to policy actions also marks a shift that has not happened in the past. Trade negotiations are now transforming into deals to achieve non-trade ends. And other than the fact is that social clauses has been another area that has been in the debate since long time as a non-trade issue being pushed under the trade agenda. Now the pretext around alliance building has been taken out. International economic relations are being reduced to zero-sum games. Sadly, the US president's obsession with this art of the deal trade policy brings with it real inflationary costs to not just the US but also the global economy. The consequences will be felt around the world by consumers, businesses, and economies. Just on a little aside, shutting down US aid has reflected very badly on the NGO funding as such. And we are feeling the pain because it has had a cascading effect. Even a UK grant made to us had to be cancelled because they're now shifting the money to defense for several reasons. But I thought it was important to mention these immediate impacts that even we've had because of these issues. And we don't know what is going to happen in the future. Sadly, the president's obsession with this art of the deal trade policy brings with it real inflationary costs to not just the US, but also the global economy. The consequences will be felt around the world by consumers, businesses, and economies. So, where do we go from here? That is a question which arises in my mind. What does Trump's trade policy mean for the present and the future of the multilateral trading system? What does it mean for the regional trade agreements and other nascent trade architectures which have emerged in the Indo-Pacific region in the past few years? Will countries be so busy scrambling to meet Trump's demands and find acceptable deals that the broader economic cooperation agenda will take a backseat? Arun Singh spoke about the fact is that ASEAN centrality is less about security, but more about global public goods. So this is a question which arises straight away. Now, is this cost of trade policy here to stay, or are we going back to an era of managed trade? These are still questions we have to see as to what the answers will be. What will it mean for American companies and consumers who will face rising input costs, shortages, and price hikes? Will we see companies relocating to the US to avoid tariffs? And what are the opportunities all this creates? And how best can countries in the Indo-Pacific region leverage these opportunities? There are no easy answers, but we are privileged to have a top-notch panel with us today to help think through some of these issues. Let me again welcome and thank Pascal, Martin, Kanwal, Stuart, and for taking out their time and joining us today. They all have been thinking deeply and writing extensively, trying to make sense of what Trump's trade policy priorities mean for the world. Just around 13 years ago, Pascal, as then WTO DG, had convened a panel to analyze 21st century challenges and chart a course for the future of trade. Both I and Talal served on that. I think we will all agree that we once again find ourselves on the precipice. We are turning against predictability and stability in global trade, which was the foundational objective of the WTO. We are surrounded by increasing uncertainty and with very little idea of how the months and years ahead will shape up. There's such a darkness. We need to navigate the challenges, leverage the opportunities, and preserve the institutional architecture as best as we can. One collective economic destiny may depend on it. Thank you once again, for joining us today. And I'm thanking the earlier panelists as well, and I look forward to a very productive discussion. To the audience, please type in your question in the chat box so that they can be taken up in the Q&A session. I know there is one pending question from a lady who wanted to know about the collaboration between Chile and India, Sanjeev, and how can it work out in the US. I think that is something which, if we have time, we'll address. Carl Mehta had to back out at the last moment, so we have much more time than we had in the earlier session. So let me begin with Martin, with a question about Trump's high tariffs on China and other countries could force Indo-Pacific economies to shift trade partnerships. Will we see a shift from a China plus one to a US plus one strategy? Martin, over to you. 7 to 8 minutes.
Okay. So first of all, I'm very sorry I didn't listen to all the first session because it obviously would have helped me to set this discussion up, except for the last commenter, who I thought was very good and said a great deal of things. So since I've got 8 minutes, I'm going to divide my remarks into two parts. The first 4 minutes or so will be about what is happening, above all, what I think is happening in the US, and the wider implication of that. And in that context, I'll get to the trading system towards the end. And the second part will be about what I think are the possible options for countries of the Indo-Pacific, and particularly India, in considering strategy specifically in the trade area, and I think those two questions, if I understand it correctly, Pradeep, is what you want me to address. That is correct. So,
Okay.
so the first point is, in my view, and we don't know. I would stress, we do not know how this will end up. But this administration in the US is a genuinely revolutionary administration with revolutionary intentions. And since it is a superpower, this means a revolution in its internal affairs and in its global policy stance. We have seen already some indications of what that would mean already in the first Trump administration, the trade wars at that time, the sort of rhetoric, his love of tariffs and so forth, particularly the trade war with China. And we have seen a significant amount of continuity with the Biden administration. So attitudes to trade, to the WTO, and to China, at least, have been pretty well continuous, I would say, already for about 8 years. And none of this should be wildly new, particularly the attitude to how the WTO functions as an institution. They don't like it. So that, I think, is more or less bipartisan in my view. And here, nothing is happening that is fundamentally new, though the degree is quite different. But what is happening here, and I think it's extremely important to understand this, is, in my view, broader. What the Trump administration would like to do is to create in the United States, in my judgment, an authoritarian, nationalist, and fundamentally unreliable in the international diplomatic field as a matter of tactics and strategy, 19th century imperial state. That's what they want to do. There are lots of details one can put forward about why they're trying to do it, how far they will get in achieving those objectives, what opposition they will meet. All this is very much open for debate because this is very early stages in this revolution. But it is clear this is, to my mind, a revolution. And I've been writing about this for this tendency now for many, many years. Indeed, I started in 2016. That was my view of the direction Donald Trump will want to go. And now, at last, he has people around him who have the will and the desire to achieve his somewhat inchoate ambitions. And we need to understand this is the sort of power the United States wants to be. And we've seen this dramatically in the relations between its neighbors, Canada and Mexico, and in the trade policy actions taken so far, and of course its attitudes to Ukraine and Europe, which are a decisive shift in the post-war policies and strategic orientation of the United States. Now, the question obviously is, how long will this last? Is this forever? And all I can say from what I've already said is we really don't know, because there are clearly going to be obstacles in the US to achieving this. And we don't know how well those will operate. We don't know, for example, in my view, whether the legal institutions, the Supreme Court and so forth, will be effective in curbing the actions of the administration. It's a pretty profound question. Now, one implication of this, which is a general proposition, which seems to me completely obvious, that if the US does continue to be run in this way by an administration headed by Donald Trump, it is a fundamentally and as a matter of principle unreliable partner. Whatever it says today may not hold tomorrow. It may not even hold to this evening. And that means that certain sorts of arrangements with the United States are by definition provisional. And unless one has very powerful leverage upon the United States, India probably has more than most, but really very few countries do, given its strengths. The United States remains now, is and will remain an unpredictable force in world affairs, though I suspect that it will side to a very significant degree with authoritarian countries, because to be blunt, that's what Donald Trump wants. That's what he likes. So what does this mean for the global trading system? Well, the WTO arrangements are essentially dead as far as the United States is concerned. They have no purchase upon US trade policy, nor, in my view, does US law. It's not at all clear that what Trump is doing is actually legal in trade policy, but that doesn't really matter either, so far as I can see, because he's going to be allowed to do it. So we should assume that in trade policy in particular, the sort of policies we've been seeing are going to continue. He will try to make deals, he will make deals, and the deals might die, quite for reasons that nobody will really be able to understand. And that leads then to the second part of the discussion. So what do other countries in the world do in this situation? What is the sensible thing for them to do? And I think this Indo-Pacific idea is quite a nice way of framing some of it. These seem to me, and I'm sure there are many other options, some of the possibilities, some of which are not mutually exclusive. One possibility is for the rest of the world to try and operate effectively the WTO minus the US. Does it continue to operate negotiations within the largest possible global environment, framework, and do this without the US, reach deals with one another, use WTO or WTO-related arbitration procedures, and continue as if the US has just dropped out. And then those countries could conceivably decide, I would personally love it if they did, that an action by the US outside the framework of the WTO against one is an action against all, and they should all comprehensively retaliate against the US by imposing comparable tariffs on against a tariff the US imposes on any other WTO member that is in accordance with WTO rules. This seems to me the H-bomb option, but it is an option that personally I would like to see. Obviously, a huge difficulty in pursuing that is that cooperation in that way within the WTO would be seen by the US and would be tantamount to cooperating with China. And the question is, in that framework, that sort of framework, where does China fit in? That question, of course, arises just as powerfully within the Indo-Pacific option that Pradeep has put forward, because China becomes a behemoth within this framework. And my strong sense is that a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific region, first and foremost, India, will be very uncomfortable being in a highly cohesive trading system in which China is far and away the biggest single power. So for that reason, I expect that the Indo-Pacific option as a real alternative to the WTO, or as a variant on this WTO survival of the WTO system that I mentioned, will be very, very uncomfortable for many of the other members, which have lots of problems with China of all kinds, which I think have already been indicated. Whatever is done on the WTO minus the US and or the Indo-Pacific and or the relationships between Indo-Pacific countries and China, obviously decisions have to be made about how to deal with the US. I've already suggested that acting together will be more effective than being picked off by the US separately. But you could imagine trying to go bilateral. All the other countries could decide to go bilateral with the US. I think this would be, for most countries, possibly not India, extremely ineffective. And the final point I wanted to make, whatever the Indo-Pacific region might end up thinking they should be doing, do not ignore in this present context, with this enormous strategic rupture that is going on between the US and Europe as a partner in future trading relations. Because if you look at this from the European point of view and the rest of the world's point of view, it is inevitable, it seems to me, that the European strategic orientation is going to shift, because the US has basically said to Europe, get lost. And this, I suppose, very unsatisfactory analysis, because I really don't know how this is going to play out and what should be done. But this very unsatisfactory analysis is sort of the way I'm thinking right now.
Thank you, thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. I did not introduce Martin or the panelists, but I suppose the audience knows who Martin is, and who I'm going to introduce next is Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO. And some of the points which have been raised by Martin are something which I would like you to respond, not only as the former DG of WTO, but also today as the president of the Law Institute, which is looking after the European interest as such. Indeed, a very radical suggestion made by Martin was that, if you have to deal with US, then we have to have a kind of coalition of those who have been not necessarily affected, but could be affected, and to deal with it. And for long, I have held the view that US has been holding the whole WTO system to hostage, and can we not have a WTO without the US? They're only 8 or 9% of the share of the world trade. Would they make much difference? But anyway, there are various questions. And over to you, Pascal. 7 to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Pradeep. Good to see you, friends. Yeah. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, thanks.
Good. So, many thanks to Martin, because he will allow me to be shorter than what I expected, because I don't want to repeat what he said. And there's a lot of what he said I agree with. I'll start with one sort of long view point, which is that until now, let's say until January, Trump won, was not very different from his predecessors. We've witnessed a slow, constant, progressive distancing by the US from the WTO. It started in 2008, roughly, and then with different stages, including the blockade, the dispute settlement at the appellate body level. But there were a series of other steps. So that was already happening. De facto, the US have now left WTO. Now, of course, this time, Trump too is different. He's not only distancing from any serious international trade obligations which the US have subscribed in the past. He's now carpet bombing the rules-based trading system. And that's a different ballgame. It's a different size. It's a different game. It's a full-fledged attack against the rules that have governed trade, as it is an attack on the rules that have governed this planet in other areas. I just want to mention one thing on which Kutz and a few of my own engagements have been working on for many, many years. What he did on anti-corruption and on transforming the US on a sort of new tax haven in a few days is another manifestation of his willingness to blow up all the rules. Now, then, of course, the question is what should be done? Can the WTO weather this shock or not? What are the alternative solutions? First, if you look at the numbers, the WTO can weather the shock. The US is 15% of world imports. What will be covered by 25 like tariffs is probably to the tune of 60% of these 15%. After all, it's 10% of the world imports which are at stake. If the rest, let's say 85 to 90% of world trade decides to stick to the rules, we will be in what rightly Martin described as WTO minus US. This can work, given that we have built in the meantime an alternative dispute settlement with one big missing participant, my friend, which is India. And the capacity of the WTO to work without the US, i.e. with a proper functioning dispute settlement system, would necessitate India joining this famous MPIA. Can this be done? Yes, I totally agree that it will not happen if this is China-driven, which is the reason why China will not drive this. I doubt that Korea, Japan, Canada, Chile, or even ASEAN would stick their neck out the window in saying, well, we announce a big coalition of WTO members who decide that we stick to our obligation, we will exercise our rights. That, of course, would be a formidable signal of stability for world trade and for the world economy. But I doubt that this will happen unless it is cleverly EU-driven. Because EU might have a sort of more balanced position that would help such a coalition to emerge. But it can be either a silent coalition, people behave the way I described, or it could be a more vocal coalition, which, in order to establish, send a signal that things, after all, may not need to change. And then, of course, the question is how do you redynamize the negotiations within the system, because we all know that the WTO is not in a good shape. But that's, in a way, another conversation. Whether there is an option for an Indo-Pacific something to be part of that, I have my doubts, to be frank. There are various games around in the Indo-Pacific region. The Chinese-led free trade agreement, which is large but shallow. The successor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the real benchmark of a modern trade agreement that goes beyond most bilateral agreements and that goes beyond WTO disciplines. But as we all know, India has so far resisted to step into that, and China, although it might want to do that, may not be nicely hosted by Japan, Korea, Australia, or even Vietnam. So, but there is, and I'll stop there on the WTO, but there is, this opens a new room for bilateral negotiation. We've seen that with a sort of revival the eternal dream of an EU-India free trade agreement of some kind. I'm too old a monkey to believe that it will happen, although there might be good reasons that were not there before to overcome domestic resistances, mostly on the Indian side, given the havoc which Trump is creating on the world trade scene. One final remark on China in this. And I'm saying this because, as you can imagine, I'm participating to quite a lot of brainstorming and strategic thinking and meetings about what to do. I'm struck that so far, most of these meetings start from the assumption that the level of China-US rivalry will remain what it is. I'm not sure about that. I'm trying honestly to revise a number of my beliefs, which is a sort of, the pillars of how you think about the big picture. And I'm not sure that this pillar, the odds are not, in my view, that Trump will change fundamentally, although I am struck at the very low level of Chinese anti-rhetoric, as well as, by the way, the manner in which the Chinese have reciprocated their 10% plus 10% tariffs. So in looking at these scenarios, I would keep a bit of time, a bit of available brain to start a conversation like the one we are having, for instance, about trade, but probably also on other, let's say, more important issues. What if two strong men, one who likes to be flattered and another who knows the Chinese way of how to get to your objective, even if you have to hide a bit of your game and flatter your counterpart, I would leave this question open for a bit of the discussion. Over to you.
Trump had weakened the WTO mechanism in his first term, and do you think will he ignore it or will he marginalize it completely? Your mic, please, Pascal. Pascal, your mic is on silent.
When Obama in 2016 started the process that led to the blockade of the appellate body in 2019, that was not Trump. That was not even a Republican.
Yeah.
It was a Democrat president. So on this, I mean, I've been following this year by year, sometimes month by month when I was DG of the WTO. The sense of travel is absolutely clear. And this is not the story of today. The story of today is not distancing from the WTO, is trying to blow out any sort of rules-based system which would constrain in any way US sovereignty.
Thank you very much. With that, let me now turn to Ambassador Kanwal Sibal. And for the audience, Kanwal has been Foreign Secretary of India and one of the most distinguished diplomats with a very great command over economic issues. So Kanwal, over to you, 7 to 8 minutes. And the question that I would like to ask you is that will US-India ties become more adversarial? Or if not, how can India negotiate a mutually beneficial economic partnership, which is what Piyush Goyal is trying to do in Washington as we stand? Over to you.
Well, I don't think that the relationship will become adversarial. It will obviously have difficulties, as other countries are facing with the new U.S. administration. But I think India's ruling class believes that India must strengthen its ties with the United States. That the most vital partnership we have today in the world is with the United States. And whatever we want to achieve in terms of modernization of our economy, access to technology, access to investment, strengthening our defense in various ways, keeping in mind also the China challenge. And then in some frontier areas of technology, to be able to develop indigenous capabilities. There is no other partner which can give us all of this as United States can. Of course, one can have access to many of these things with the Europeans, but there you are dealing with individual countries. And there are a few countries which are like Germany or France or the UK, which can give you access piecemeal in some of these things. But if you take the totality of what India wants to be able to get from another country, the United States clearly, as one country, is the most productive partner going into the future. Number two, and I have it on good authority, that on our side, people concerned started working very seriously, very minutely on what our choices should be, what our policies should be, and what are the negatives that we can apprehend if either of the two candidates won the election. That in case Kamala Harris won, what would be our options in terms of going ahead? And if Trump won, then what would be those options? So all the scenarios were considered very extensively, very deeply. A lot of homework was done. The fact that Trump, who's got an obsession with tariffs, will threaten increased tariffs on India because he never forgets to mention India as the tariff king. On this particularly, a lot of deep homework was done, going through various tariff lines and this and that what is it we could do to open up reduce our tariffs. And as you know, as a kind of a goodwill gesture, even before the Prime Minister visited the United States, we, in our budget, decreased duties on some of the items of interest to the United States. And this was done deliberately. And this was done in deep consultation with the Finance Ministry. They had very good discussions during Prime Minister's visit there with Lutnick, with Greer, the U.S. TR. But they had gone very well prepared. And they could lay things on the table and have substantive discussions, which is why, and this surprised me also, that even when the government was in power for just about a month, they were able to agree to this very substantial joint statement. Even in the State Department or in other departments, there were not people who had actually filled the posts and who could actually be interlocutors in terms of discussing all that is there in the joint statement. But it's a very substantive joint statement. The reason is this, that a lot of work was done behind the scenes, especially with the White House and the people in charge there. And therefore, a common agenda of how we should move forward was agreed upon. And which is why, as Arun Singh said in the earlier panel, many of the very critical areas of our understandings with the United States on technology and defense and everything else have been adopted by the new Trump administration, but they have been rebranded. But the substance remains the same. We have also, of course, there is a bit of unpredictability as to what the United States may do in terms of the discussions we're going to have a multi-sector trade agreement by this fall, the first phase of that. Our side is fairly optimistic that something can be achieved by October or November or whatever it is. Though skeptical, those who are skeptical think that things are never as simple as that, and that at the top level you can have all kinds of understandings and discussions, but when the bureaucracy and other get into the act, then they'll find various reasons to block the progress or the rapidity of the progress. But as you know now, the latest sort of bargain that is being discussed, and it has now been made public, is 0 for 0 tariffs. That we will remove all tariffs on U.S. industrial products, and U.S. removes all tariffs on Indian exports, minus agriculture. That area has been kept out. Whether this can happen or not, I can't say. But one thing is certain from our side, that we are now going with a much more positive mind, not with a negative mind. Earlier, Mr. Lamy said that, you're not sure about the India-EU agreement because India has been obstructed. But from what I gather, the mood is very different. I think we've seen the writing on the wall. We've seen what Trump's, passions are with regard to tariffs and everything else. That we have to find some ways of accommodating him at the same time protecting our interests, a kind of a substantive give and take, and make rational arguments for it. Of course, there will be issues like the digital economy and government procurement and non-tariff barriers and the regulatory aspect. And Trump has given directions to the Commerce Secretary and the U.S. TR to look at all these elements, not purely what are the tariffs, in terms of how they are impeding the export of U.S. products to India. So we'll see. So the problems are not over, but there is a sense of quiet confidence that we may be able to handle a difficult situation. The second thing which was mentioned is about the rest of the members of the WTO joining together and putting up a broad front against the United States. Now, I've not been in the WTO negotiations, but I've spoken to our ambassadors to the WTO, and very recently, and they've been saying that even in Geneva, the rest of the WTO members haven't given that much importance to the United States ambassador there. That there hasn't been that kind of a thing that, we must get the Americans on board and this and that and that. So yes, the rest of the WTO members can commit themselves to continue working under the WTO rules and preserve them, because it's very, very important for countries like India and the Global South and others that the only international organization which actually is based on a trading of a global trading order is the WTO. And we, all this Section 301 and this and that, all the things that the Americans were doing unilaterally in the past, which is very troublesome. At least there we had a forum in which complaints can be brought against each other, issues could be litigated, and some satisfaction obtained, etc., etc. Now, in terms of the rest of the countries getting together, as was rightly mentioned, that China will pose a problem. China itself is seen by not only the United States, but by European Union, by India, as a abuser of the WTO rules and regulations. They have abused the WTO right from the start and built up these huge capacities, which are now creating a major problem for the rest of the world. And amazingly, they are still self-declared as a developing country. Now, there's been a talk about reform of the WTO and this and that, but let's say now, I don't know how the reform agenda will proceed. Those who are experts in this matter can say something about it. Now, with regard to the Indo-Pacific, as a kind of a body which can challenge the United States in this area. Now, here the thing is that India, for example, is not a member of the RCEP. whereas all the other Indo-Pacific countries are members. In fact, I've had talks with the Japanese who've been pressing me as to why have we not joining RCEP, RCEP. And we have our reasons, because we don't want our economy to suffer further from the Chinese unmanageable exports to our country. So I think having the Indo-Pacific as a kind of a collectivity, which can then, under China's leadership and China's weight, can counter the United States, I don't think this is going to work. The second thing, in terms of investments and everything else, you know, under pressure, Japan has announced major investments in the United States. South Korea has also, and Trump is boasting that Taiwan is going to invest God knows how many billions of dollars to set up this semiconductor units in the United States. Now, India doesn't have that capacity. So we are not going to be able to satisfy Trump by saying that we are going to invest billions in order to, placate you, this and that and that. So we have to keep this in mind. Finally, a couple of things that Trump is now also attacking the BRICS. He has rather, I don't know on what ground, he threatened to impose 100% tariffs on BRICS if BRICS move towards de-dollarization or towards a BRICS currency. This is absolutely not on the agenda, neither de-dollarization nor a BRICS currency. India is not interested. India has said so openly. But this is something we have to keep in mind. As you know, this could be for different reasons. Maybe Elon Musk is behind this. The U.S. Secretary of State will not be attending the BRICS, the G20 foreign ministers meeting in South Africa. So even when it comes to the G20, in terms of the general disregard for multilateralism, we find that the United States is distancing itself away from these organizations. And the G20 was formed, as all of you know, I don't have to say this, it's to have the G7 countries and the emerging economies together to be able to shape the global economic agenda. But even here, I think we're going to face some same headwinds. And the last point is that United States has walked out again. Trump has walked out again from the climate change agreement, from the Paris climate change agreement. Now, this puts at risk the entire effort of India and the Global South and others to have access to finance and technology from the developed world. Now, this is going to be extremely difficult with the kind of attitudes that the United States has. So and this is going to therefore cost all of us, not only the Global South, but even the Global North, in terms of the challenges that we face, we will face, the humanity faces with regard to the climate change. So I'll stop here and then we'll see how the discussion goes.
Thank you very much, Kanwal, for an excellent exposition. With that, may I now turn to the last speaker of the panel, and we hope that we'll have time for a second round with all the panelists. Stuart Habenson has been Hong Kong's ambassador to the WTO in the past and has also been advisor to both Pascal Lamy as well as Sukhachai Panishpakri, the former DG and of the WTO and Secretary General UNCTAD. Stuart, over to you.
Thanks very much, Pradeep, indeed.
And I must mention that Stuart had also listened carefully in the first panel. He was there throughout in the first session. And thank you very much for that, Stuart.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks very much. And I have the great fortune of following on from a stellar cast of speakers. So there's very little really that I need to add. But I mean, I think I would just say that I do agree very much that I think this is a moment of extreme danger for the WTO and the multilateral trading system, because I think as a practical matter, the US is now outside the system. I mean, they have dispensed with their tariff ceilings. They've dispensed with the MFN principle, and of course, for a long time now, they've also torpedoed dispute settlement. So I think we just have to take it they're basically outside the system. And the question is, how is everybody else going to react? And I also agree with previous speakers that ideally there would be a coordinated response from other members. You know, issues like the MPIA, which Pascal mentioned, I think also plurilateral negotiations, which have made some progress in the WTO, and that sort of thing would be very helpful. Perhaps reforming decision making, etc. But I must say I see a lot of difficulties with there being a coordinated response, because you know it would be rather easy, it seems to me, for the US to peel others away from such a coordinated response, and there would be bilateral negotiations and deals and that sort of thing. I've also been reading just recently the report which USTR has just released about the WTO at 30. This is quite an interesting document, and it comes on the 5-yearly cycle where Congress has a chance to bring forward resolutions to leave the WTO. And I think one or two senators, such as Senator Hawley, for example, have already said that they're going to bring forward a resolution for the US to leave the WTO. So we have to wait and see how that plays out. But of course, if the WTO did leave if the US did leave the WTO, that would mean that all of the other members didn't have any obligations towards the US. And I guess that could have serious economic consequences, but one wonders whether the current Trump administration would care too much about that. They may feel that they can survive quite happily through managed trade, VERs, and all of that sort of thing that we thought we'd dispensed with many years ago. I can see that coming back. Anyway, we're now in this 90-day window, I think it is, where senators or congressmen can bring forward this resolution to leave the WTO. So that's going to be interesting. But the report that I mentioned is also quite interesting, because it recites the familiar litany of complaints that the US has about the WTO, not only dispute settlement, but also negotiating paralysis, the differential treatment, developing country status, and all of these things, which we've heard from, I think, as Martin and Pascal mentioned, since the Obama administration. So these things are not new. But in the conclusion of this report, they say that, interestingly, they say the United States, and I'm quoting here, the United States has tried and will continue to try to solve these problems, but patience wears thin. That's the end of the quote. So clearly, the WTO is on notice, but they haven't given a signal that the administration intends to leave formally. This is just a report that's come out in the last few days, so that's interesting. So yeah, I see the future more as, unfortunately, as managed trade and all of that sort of thing. China might well go for a phase 2 deal. I don't have any information on that, but I think it's clearly a possibility that we may need to bear in mind. And then I think, finally, I would just mention a few things in relation to the purpose of the tariffs. And it seems to be becoming increasingly clear. Of course, it's to address trade imbalances and all of that sort of thing. But the mantra seems to be to drive production to the US. That's what it's all about. It's about reshoring. It's about jobs in the US. That's quite interesting. We've had, Taiwan Semiconductor saying they're going to invest 100 billion in the US. And there's talk about cars being made in the US, more cars, steel, etc. So that's quite interesting. But one wonders where, from an economic point of view, where that leads, given US labor costs compared with production elsewhere. And are they going to, be living in a bubble? And where do they draw the line as to what they're going to produce? Because there must be some things that are not very realistic to be produced in the US. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then finally on China, I mean, I always say this. I guess I must be regarded as an apologist for China, but it's really striking always, particularly with the US and in the West generally, actually, that there's never any recognition given at all of the possibility that China's success might emerge to even a very small degree from the talent and the hard work and the entrepreneurial ability of Chinese people. I mean it's just cheating. That's what it's always ascribed to. And I think as long as the West can't face facts about its own shortcomings, then this problem will persist. Thanks very much, Pradeep.
Thank you, Stuart. I would like to go into a second round. There is a question from the audience, a very interesting question, which I would like to pose to all the panelists. What it says is from Rahul Kapavalapu. Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy emphasizes a free and open Indo-Pacific, yet his transactional approach to alliances often created uncertainty. Given this, do you think his policies strengthen or weaken regional security architecture, especially in countering China? And how do you see Biden's approach building on or diverging from it? Let me start with Martin.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I'm afraid I didn't understand all that.
Right. Now, let me repeat that. Is Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy emphasizes a free and open Indo-Pacific, yet his transactional approach in alliances often created uncertainty. Given this, do you think his policies strengthened or weakened regional security architecture, especially in countering China? And how do you see Biden's approach building on or diverging from it? When he's getting into the history of it.
I suppose, my first reaction is the question, I hope I understand properly, but the question of the security architecture, particularly as it relates to India, it seems to me not quite the same, though it obviously has some relationship with the future Indo-Pacific trading arrangements. It is clear that the way Trump sees the world means that he relates everything to everything else, but his trade policy is pretty clearly not the same thing and not motivated by the same considerations as his security policy. So the decision to quasi-withdraw from NATO and to abandon Ukraine doesn't look fundamentally related to trade considerations, and those will be dealt with, I think, by his tariff policies, which are important. Now, I'm not saying that these things aren't connected in some way, but I see them as separate. On the trade policy, I would make just the obvious point. In his first term, which isn't that long ago, Trump negotiated the US Mexico-Canada agreement. I think it was called an agreement. It might have been arrangement. I don't know. Pascal will know, something like that. And he did it after 2 very hard years of negotiation. And one of the negotiators was Chrystia Freeland for Canada, who is a very dear friend of mine and with whom I discussed this at great length. So he himself signed this deal, and he seemed to sign it pretty happily after fairly tough negotiations. Last week, though, he tore it up, to put it bluntly, and then 5 days later, he tore up part of his tearing up. That is to say, the part that deals with the most important sectors, the auto sector. A rational man would conclude from this that an agreement reached with Trump, and I stress this, is worthless as an agreement. It's about as much worth, in my view, as an agreement with Putin. An agreement with Mr. Xi is, I think, a different thing, but I may be wrong on that. That's my view. So that doesn't mean you can't sign an agreement with Trump, but the question you have to ask yourself is not, is there an agreement that has been signed? And that because the answer to that doesn't matter. The question is, today, in light of how Trump thinks, is he likely to consider it's worth keeping to this agreement? It is a transactional deal is a transactional deal. Every day, as it were, Trump will reevaluate whether the agreements he has made are worth having. And he could change his mind. Now, in dealing, and this is the first point. The second point is, what does this mean for India? India, as I think has been pointed out by the ambassador at some length, and I agree with him on this, though I didn't agree with everything he said, but I agree with this. India is a special case because for Trump, it's an important country with which he can do business and is potentially an important security ally against a major rival. And that means that India is a country with the potential to reach deals with Trump that will stick because they're worth it for him. And one of the reasons that he's going to be quite comfortable making this arrangement is that he absolutely doesn't believe that India is ever going to be a serious industrial competitor. If, of course, he's wrong about that, and India does become a serious industrial competitor, he will tear up the agreement. This is not a question, it is a certainty, given his even bigger policy objectives. But the point then is, you can think about being part of it, whatever it is. You can think about being part of it because India is India and has weight here. But you have to understand you're dealing not only with a transactional president, but a transactional president on a daily basis. And that's a very specific sort of partner.
Thank you, Martin. Pascal?
I do agree with what Martin has said, as well as, by the way, what Stuart has said. One point I want to make about the scenario according to which the US would leave the WTO. I can see no real benefit for the US to do that, given where they are, i.e., de facto member, de jure member, but de facto out, so not bound by the obligation. I can see a few reasons not to do it. For instance, the US would lose the whole of the IP protection which they get from the TRIPS agreement if they would lose the WTO, which means that anybody on this planet could stop paying royalties, which, if I remember well, represents a number somewhere between 150 and 200 billion a year of revenues coming from outside into the US pockets. So that's one example where I think it would be very risky. And I think if patience wears thin, there's a long time for thinness before you shoot in your own foot. For the rest, I do believe that for the moment, the sort of collective coordination resolve is not there in the WTO membership. But suffice to consider that de facto, if not with a big coalition agreement, WTO members will keep abiding to their obligations. After all, after some time, this may play the role of sort of stabilization of the system. So again, I think the odds that what Trump is doing is the beginning of a total return to a non-rules-based international trade system are relatively low at this stage. The benefits of keeping the system for many, many countries, including most poor developing countries who know full well that they still rely very much on external markets to grow their economy and their welfare will stay. So on this, for the moment, I'm not among those crying wolf. Over to you.
Thank you. Kanwal?
Well, we must recall that it is Trump actually who boosted Quad, in the sense that it is during his time that the Quad was upgraded to political level. And this was during his first term. So there is no reason why he would now in his second term seek to weaken Quad in any way. In a joint statement with him this time, there is a reference to Quad, though it is a bit relatively muted in the sense that there is no direct attack on China. But in this context, what I'd like to say is that he may want to have a trade deal with China, fine. But at the end of the day, the issues between China and United States are not trade issues. These are large strategic issues and major strategic issues. And China is not going to change not going to change its course, or after all, they've made their ambitions very clear in so many papers that they want to reach X level by such and such date, Y level at another date, and in 2049, they will become the preeminent power in the world. So the challenge to the United States will remain, even if at the same time, the trade relationship is nurtured. Now, we are doing the same thing with China ourselves, though the levels of the challenge that China faces, the level of challenges is not quite the same as United States and China over Taiwan or in the Western Pacific and all that. We have 50,000 soldiers facing each other even now in Ladakh. But our trade with China is increasing year by year. It's going to reach $130 billion this year. But believe me that if you ask the ruling establishment in India or the public opinion, they see China as the most adversarial country to India. And we don't trust China. So this kind of a ballet will go on, where you can't ignore China as the largest manufacturing power in the world, etc. I don't have to say that. But that's not going to diminish the strategic issues that are at play, whether between India and China or United States and China. Number three, United States is continuing to, even under Trump, continuing to boost some of our capabilities that we need to counter China in the maritime sphere. And during Prime Modi's visit, there has been progress in this regard. And these capabilities are China-centric. They are not Pakistan-centric or Russia-centric. There's also an agreement to, let's say if it happens or not, to modify the ITAR so that there can be, so that the export controls of these sensitive technologies to India can be reduced. And finally, I think the point is well made that if India was seen as an industrial competitor by Trump, then he would come down with a ton of bricks on us. But fortunately, in 4 years, much as we may have these ambitions, we are not going to become an industrial competitor to China. And after Trump is no longer there, then we'll see. Then we'll see what may happen.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Pradeep. I couldn't hear you for a minute. Yeah.
I think it's a final round.
Right. Well, I think the ambassador described the relationship between India and the US, if I heard him correctly, and maybe I didn't, as a something of a ballet. And I think that's a good description actually, because even on the trade side, many of the problems that the US says it has with the WTO, for example, in terms of negotiating paralysis and differential treatment, developing country carve-outs. These are kind of problems in inverted commas for India. But I really don't think that I can see the US putting much pressure on India on these issues, because India is too valuable in terms of being a geopolitical counterweight to China. So I think there will always be a tendency for them to reach deals. And in fact, I remember, going back to the Biden days, there was a major kind of sorting out of disputes between the US and India bilaterally on agricultural matters, which are hugely sensitive. I don't think it would be much different under the Trump regime. So I think that's going to be an interesting ballet that will continue for a while yet. The other point I would just make there is that it's quite interesting. I was talking about the driving production towards the US, and clearly China has been investing heavily in countries like Vietnam and also Mexico, with a view to exporting to the US. And in fact, Vietnam and Mexico have got huge trade surpluses with the US, which Trump is now targeting. So my question is, and I'd be interested in any other views on this, where will Chinese investment go? These avenues are now being closed off, it seems. Will Chinese investment in some areas be welcome in the US? Question mark, I don't know. And India, I think Chinese investment in India is very low from what I gather historically. And the ambassador is saying that, China is seen as a threat economically. So maybe Chinese investment is not welcome in India, but I'm sure the Chinese are going to invest somewhere. I'm not sure where though. Thanks.
Let me respond, Stuart, to the point which you made about Chinese investment in India. There is already a very big debate going on in India. Now, part of the policy establishment is in favor of inviting Chinese to invest in India, but subject to screening and subject to sensitivity of sectors where they can invest. We still need FDI. We are a growing economy, as you know, and Therefore, that debate is still not settled. But slowly, Chinese investment is coming in, and it's going to grow. In any case, Dalal, do you have any views to add to between your panel and this panel that you participated in or heard very carefully?
Pradeep, may I say something on this? What you
Please.
said just now. See, the
Yeah.
dilemma before us is that the narrative now is that we must have resilient and trustworthy supply chains.
Right.
If we bring China in to invest in India and then use India as a base for export to the West, then I think we are negating that narrative. I don't think we want to run that risk at all.
Right. No, but we are still short of money. We still need investment, and we have scope.
Yes,
and that was the reason why the chief economic advisor in his alternative on the economic survey said that.
There's a place where Chinese investments could grow, which is the EU. But with a few strings attached. I mean, what the EU is thinking about now, if you take the example of electric cars, is to do with China, what China did to the EU 30 years ago, when we had a good technological lead on combustion engine. We wanted a chunk of the Chinese market. And they said, welcome, but joint ventures and technology transfer. They now have a lead of 10 to 15 years on EVs. But it might be that as things go, the EU starts realizing that it doesn't have the technological or the industrial capacity. It needs to decarbonize. It won't probably come easily from the US, who, by the way, are not in a very different spot as compared to China in terms of electric mobility. So there may be, I'm not saying there will be, but there may be opportunities if a few things change in the geopolitics of the game. Over to you.
Thank you. Martin?
Yes, actually, I was going to make exactly the same point. I've already hinted that in previous columns. I believe we are in the middle of an enormous global geostrategic realignment. And a big part of that is going to be within the West, which is no longer existent. Now there are several aspects of it which people should note. One, obviously, is actually the genuine desire of the US to forge a closer relationship with India, and this has already been mentioned, is a matter of continuity. I would stress, however, that you should not assume that what Trump did in Trump 1 is necessarily what he will do in Trump 2, which has seemed to be suggested. In fact, I would suggest that what he did this week will not necessarily indicate what he's going to do next week. Do not assume that degree of continuity. You have to ask yourself, as I've stressed, do the same considerations apply to him today as they did last week? But I think the India realignment is pretty safe, because every week, when the Americans look, this administration or any Americans look at the world, they will think a close alignment with India has all upsides and no downsides. I think that is a very big point. However, it does seem to me plausible, we're not yet certainly there, but very plausible that the US is pursuing a realignment at the moment of Russia from China towards the US. And will they succeed with that, which is an inverse Kissinger-Nixon of early 1970s? Will that happen? I honestly don't know. I have lots of thoughts about it, but I think it's pretty clear that's what they want to do, and it's one of the reasons they are preparing to hand Ukraine over. The third point is the Europeans are therefore in a major strategic bind, which is economic and political. And in any case, they're in the middle of an unbelievably painful divorce, which has, at least in Eastern Europe, very clear strategic threats. So cozying up to China, persuading it to, during the transition, if it is a transition from a China-Russia oriented to China to a Russia oriented to the US, during that transition to curb Russia, but more importantly, for the US, the China-EU relationship to become closer. And that will happen if precisely what Pascal suggests, which is China invests in Europe and allows top technology transfer. And the final point I would make, which I think is crucial, is that in the world we are now seeing, with the US operating as it is now operating, and given the balances of forces between China and the US, and particularly the simply staggering innovative capacity that China is demonstrating, and I can go to that in considerable detail, and the damage, in my view, these damage, but I think the immense damage that Trumpism will do to the US productive system over time, I am putting my long-term bet in the great strategic rivalry of our time on China.
I agree with you, Martin. I mean, in the overall, what I see is that there are so many things happening. And so, really, I mean, for example, I mean, China could use its rare earth monopoly in order to, even access markets in Europe as a bargaining lever. I mean, there are 101, I would say, million possibilities which might happen in this kind of, as Martin rightly said, there is going to be a major geostrategic alignment which will happen and will continue to happen. And in that particular context, I think the way Trump is, is should I, for want of a better word, upsetting the world order, not necessarily upsetting, but or at least playing with it, is going to lead to new kind of alignments, new kind of needs, and so on. With that, may I request Talal, do you have any views?
I'm a good student, and I've been listening carefully and learning from what has been said and taking my notes, which make me feel more sure and confident that we need a total solution. We know that what is happening, we know that there are things that are unpredictable, we know that we have problems all the time, but what we know also, and this is more important, is that this is because there is no world order in action. Of course, President Trump will continue to want to exercise his own rule, but I think that if we approach the project, if we approach these problems, all of these issues, in a one world meeting of experts and come out with a new model for the world, we cannot sit and wait to see what's going to happen to every country in the world because of what Trump wants to do, which is what I see happening. What we need to do is to predict the future and not just wait for it. So I would believe that the solution to all these concerns, which are all important and correct, and I'm grateful for what I heard, if a panel or a working group of leaders from the non-government sector of countries of the world come out with a plan for a new world model, this model is done. You cannot bring a dead person alive again. This is done, and if it's still in its dying stage, but it is done, finished. So let us think of a new order where we have fairness and justice for everybody and democracy for everybody. where everybody is treated, big or small, important or unimportant, to be treated with the same rule. And if we produce such a model, which I'm sure we can, if we produce it, then offer it to the world, I am sure it is not possible for the US to want to be out. And particularly if we get the blessing of the US, and I know that the US wants solutions. They have concerns about the leadership of China and taking over the world. They have said it, presidents of the US have said it multiple times, that they are concerned about China taking over, and that it is it's a disaster for them to. So what they're doing now is a survival fight, because these presidents have said, U.S. presidents have said, China provides an existential threat to the U.S. leadership of the world.
So thank you very much, Talal. We are now coming to an end, and may I now request Sanjeev Joshipura to respond to the points which you made, and which he did respond even earlier. Sanjeev, can you please do the concluding remarks, responding to the points which was made by Talal earlier as well as now again? Sanjeev, are you there?
Yes.
Sanjeev.
You're talking to me?
No, I'm talking to Sanjeev Joshipura.
Huh?
It seems he's not.
I'm sorry.
Well, he's not there. With that, let me come to a conclusion. Pascal had to go to another meeting, so he's already bade goodbye. And thank you all.
I'm a businessman, and I think I'm the only businessman in this meeting. And I like to address problems with a business mentality.
Thank you very much.
We want action. We want results. I want to be able to produce an end product. So if you with your honorable
Talal will get back. We'll get back to you on your point bilaterally. And with that, let me now thank all the panelists, and to bring this meeting to conclusion for a fantastic discussion in both the sessions, and very well conducted. I would like to also thank Sanjeev. He doesn't see, his computer is on, but he's not there. Must be busy doing something else. Thank you very much. And we'll be producing a summary report of this on YouTube as well, about both the sessions. Jorge, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.